The sugar bowl sat empty on the counter when the knock came. 3 soft raps that made Grace Holloway freeze mid-step in her darkened kitchen. She hadn't heard footsteps on the porch, hadn't heard a car pull into the gravel drive next door, and in the silence of rural Missouri on a February night in 1974, every unexpected sound carried weight. This was the moment that would unravel everything she thought she knew about loneliness. Grace pressed her palm against the counter's cool Formica edge, orienting herself in the space she'd memorized down to the inch. 26 years old, blind for 3 years, and utterly convinced that her life had narrowed to these 4 walls and the pitying visits from her sister twice a month. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. She smoothed her cotton dress, pale yellow, her sister had told her, though colors had become abstractions now, and made her way to the door with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate a world designed for eyes she no longer had. "Hello?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Evening, ma'am. I'm real sorry to bother you so late." The voice was male, deep but gentle, with the soft drawl of someone who'd spent his whole life in the Ozarks. "My boy and I just moved in next door this afternoon, and I'm trying to make him some hot cocoa before bed, but I seem to have packed the sugar in a box I can't find. Would you happen to have a cup I could borrow?" Grace's hand tightened on the doorframe. A neighbor. The little craftsman house next door had sat vacant for 8 months, and she'd grown accustomed to the silence, the absence of judgment, the safety of invisibility. Now someone would see her, see the white cane by the door, the way she moved with her hands slightly extended, the careful blankness in her eyes that people always noticed first. Yes. Just a moment." She left the door open and made her way back to the kitchen, counting steps, trailing her fingers along the wall. Behind her, she heard the man step inside, his boots heavy on the threshold, and then a smaller sound. Lighter footsteps, a child's shuffle. "Stay there, Danny," the man said softly. "Let the lady get what we need." Grace reached the kitchen and opened the canister by touch, scooping sugar into a measuring cup with practiced ease. When she turned back, she could sense them both in her doorway, the father and son, watching her move through her dark world with the fluid confidence of 3 years' practice. "Here." She held out the cup, and the man crossed the room to take it from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, calloused, warm, the hands of someone who worked outdoors. "You can return it whenever." "Thank you, ma'am. I'm Tom Brennan, by the way. This here's my son, Danny. He's 5. Grace Holloway." A pause hung between them, and Grace waited for what always came next. The awkward recognition, the stammered apology, the too loud voice people used when they realized she couldn't see. But Tom Brennan simply said, "It's nice to meet you, Miss Holloway. We'll let you get back to your evening." They were almost out the door when the boy spoke for the first time. "Daddy, why doesn't the lady have any lights on?" Grace's breath caught. Children were always the most direct, the least filtered. She braced herself for the explanation, the discomfort, the inevitable retreat. But Tom's response surprised her. "Some people don't need lights, son. Come on now." After they left, Grace stood in her dark kitchen for a long time, the ghost of Tom Brennan's touch still warming her fingertips. She hadn't told him she was blind, and he hadn't asked. It was such a small thing, that absence of pity, but it felt like the first full breath she'd taken in 3 years. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that Tom Brennan's late wife, Sarah, had died in the same accident that had stolen Grace's sight on a rain-slicked highway outside Springfield in 1971. The accident that had left Grace trapped in twisted metal for 2 hours, listening to a woman in the car ahead singing a lullaby to keep them both from panic until the rescue crews arrived. The same lullaby Tom still sang to his son every night. But that recognition was still days away, hidden in the careful distance Grace kept from everyone and the grief Tom carried like a stone in his chest. For now, there was only the sugar bowl, the knock on the door, and the first fragile thread of connection between two people who'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. Before we go any further, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? Drop a comment below, and if this story has you hooked already, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss where this goes next. Grace had lived alone since the accident, convinced that her blindness made her a burden no one would willingly carry. But Tom Brennan had just walked into her life with nothing more than a request for sugar and a child's sleepy voice. Could a single knock really change everything? The blue enamel coffee pot hissed on the stove the next morning when Grace heard the boy's laughter through her kitchen window. High and bright, punctuated by the deeper rumble of his father's voice, the sounds painted a picture of the life next door, one she'd convinced herself she had no right to imagine for her own future. This was the beginning of a routine that would force Grace to question everything she believed about her worth. She stood at the sink, washing her single breakfast dish with methodical care, listening. The Brennans were in their backyard, and from what she could hear, Tom was teaching Danny how to hammer nails into wood. Each metallic ping carried across the frost-brittled grass, followed by the boy's excited chatter and his father's patient corrections. Grace found herself smiling despite the ache in her chest, the old, familiar longing for a normal life that she'd learned to suppress but never quite extinguished. A little to the left, buddy. That's it. Now hold it steady. The hammering resumed, and Grace dried her hands. Moving to the window she couldn't see through, but always stood beside anyway. Her sister Ellen had described the view once. Rolling hills, a stand of oak trees along the property line. The neighboring house with its sagging front porch that Tom would probably fix now that someone lived there again. Grace had memorized the description, built it in her mind like a painting she could only touch. The knock came again that afternoon. 2 o'clock, she knew from the grandfather clock in her living room that chimed the hours. This time she was ready, had even put on her nicer dress. The green one, Ellen said, brought out the auburn in her hair. Not that it mattered. Not that she was trying to impress anyone. Miss Holloway? Tom's voice carried that same gentle quality from the night before. I wanted to return your measuring cup. And well, Danny made you something. Grace opened the door to the smell of fresh pine and sawdust, the scent clinging to Tom like a signature. She heard the boy shift his weight, something rustling in his small hands. It's a birdhouse, Danny announced proudly. Daddy helped, but I did all the hammering on the roof. He said maybe you could put it in your yard so the birds would have a home. Grace's throat tightened. She reached out, and Danny placed the small wooden structure in her hands. Her fingers traced its edges, rough in places where the boy's hammer had missed, smooth where Tom's steady hands had guided him. A birdhouse, a gift that assumed she would want to attract life and sound to her solitary existence. It's beautiful, she whispered, and meant it. How do you know if you can't? Danny started, but Tom's hand must have landed on his shoulder because the boy went quiet. Grace knelt down, bringing herself to Danny's level. I can feel how hard you worked on it. Every hammer strike is right here in the wood. That's how I know it's beautiful. The boy was silent for a moment, processing. Then, can you feel other stuff too? Like if someone's smiling? Danny, Tom said, a warning in his voice. But Grace laughed. Actually laughed. Something she couldn't remember doing in months. Sometimes. People's voices change when they smile. Yours goes up at the end, like a song. What about when people are sad? The question landed differently, heavier. Grace straightened slowly, her fingers still wrapped around the birdhouse. Yes, I can hear that too. Tom cleared his throat. We should let you get back to your day, Miss Holloway. Come on, Danny. Wait. The word escaped before Grace could stop it. Would you both like to come in for lemonade? I made some this morning, and there's far too much for just me. The silence stretched long enough that Grace began to regret the invitation. She'd broken her own rule. Keep people at arm's length. Don't let them close enough to see how much she needed them, how desperately lonely these walls had become. We'd like that, Tom said finally, if it's no trouble. No trouble at all. She led them inside, and for the first time in 3 years, Grace's house felt like something other than a prison. Danny asked questions about everything. Why she kept her curtains open if she couldn't see outside. How she knew where all her furniture was. Whether she missed colors or just the shapes of things. Tom tried to shush him twice, but Grace waved off his concerns. It's fine. Most people are too afraid to ask. They sat at her small kitchen table, Danny swinging his legs and gulping lemonade while Tom sipped his slowly, and Grace could feel his gaze on her. Not pitying, but curious, assessing. She knew what he was seeing, a woman who'd learned to function, to survive, but maybe not quite to live. Danny's mother, Tom said suddenly, the words careful and measured. She died 3 years ago. Car accident on Highway 65. Grace's hand froze on her glass. Highway 65. Springfield. I'm so sorry, she managed. It was raining. The roads were bad. They said she died instantly, that she didn't suffer. Tom's voice carried the hollow quality of someone reciting facts he'd repeated too many times. Danny doesn't remember much. He was only 2. But I remember, Grace thought, her pulse quickening. I remember the rain and the screaming metal and the woman in the car ahead who sang to keep us both from losing our minds while we waited for help. She couldn't say it. Not yet. The coincidence seemed impossible, the kind of cruel twist that only happened in stories, not real life. And if she was wrong, if Tom's wife had been in some other accident, on some other rainy night, then speaking the words aloud would only open old wounds for no reason. What about you? Tom asked gently. How did you? Car accident, Grace said, the lie of omission bitter on her tongue. Same year. Danny had gone quiet, his child's intuition sensing the weight that had settled over the adults. Then he started humming, soft and unfocused at first, then resolving into a melody that made Grace's blood turn to ice. Hush now, sweet darling, don't you cry. Mama's here and the stars are nigh. The lullaby. The same one the woman had sung in the darkness, her voice steady even as sirens wailed in the distance, and Grace's legs were pinned beneath the dashboard, and everything hurt so much she thought she might die from the pain alone. Where did you learn that song? Grace's voice came out strangled. Danny stopped humming. Daddy sings it every night. He says Mama used to sing it to me when I was a baby. The measuring cup slipped from Grace's nerveless fingers and shattered on the floor. How could she tell them the truth? Glass fragments scattered across the linoleum like stars, each piece catching the afternoon light. Grace couldn't see but could somehow feel in the sudden tension of the room. Tom was on his feet immediately, his chair scraping back, his hands reaching to steady her even as she knelt, fingers searching for the broken pieces. This was the moment the past would stop being something they'd survived separately and become something they'd shared all along. "Don't, you'll cut yourself," Tom said, his hand closing gently over her wrist. "Let me get it. Danny, stay in your chair, buddy." But Grace couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The melody still echoed in her ears, mixing with the memory of rain and twisted metal and a woman's voice cutting through the dark. "Hush now, sweet darling." She'd heard it for 2 hours straight while they waited for the jaws of life, while paramedics worked to free them both, while Grace's world had narrowed to pain and fear and that one constant thread of sound, keeping her tethered to consciousness. "Miss Holloway?" Tom's voice had changed, concern sharpening its edges. "Grace? Are you okay?" She lifted her face toward him, toward the man whose wife had died singing that song. "What was her name? Your wife. What was her name?" "Sarah." The word came out soft, confused. "Sarah Brennan. Why, Sarah Margaret Brennan drove a blue Chevrolet Impala?" Tom went very still. Grace could hear his breathing change, could feel the air in the kitchen shift as he processed what she was asking. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to barely a whisper. "How do you know that?" Grace's hands were shaking now, the glass forgotten on the floor between them. "The accident. Highway 65 just outside Springfield, March 14th, 1971. It wasn't just raining. There was ice on the bridges, a semi-jackknifed and 3 cars piled up behind it." "Jesus." Tom sank back into his chair. "You were there?" "I was in the car behind hers." The words tumbled out now, 3 years of silence breaking open. "My Honda Civic. I hit the truck when I tried to stop and her car was crushed between mine and the semi. We were both trapped. The paramedics said it took 2 hours to cut us free." Danny had gone quiet, his small face turned between the two adults, trying to understand the gravity of what was unfolding. Tom's voice came out rough, damaged. "They told me she was alone, that she died alone in that car while they worked to free her. She wasn't alone." Grace's cheeks were wet now, tears she didn't try to stop. "I couldn't see her. My windshield was shattered, and there was blood in my eyes. But I could hear her. She talked to me the whole time, told me her name, told me about her baby boy at home, told me she had to stay alive because Danny needed his mama. She sang to you." "Yes, to both of us, I think. She said singing helped her stay calm, helped her focus on something besides the pain. And it did. God, it did. I would have lost my mind without her voice." Grace pressed her hands to her face. "When they finally got me out, they told me about my injuries. Shattered pelvis, fractured skull, brain trauma. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive, but I'd lost my sight. By the time I woke up in the hospital 3 days later, I didn't even know if the woman in the car ahead had survived. I asked, but nobody could tell me anything. And then my own recovery took over, and I never followed up. I never knew." The silence that fell was profound, heavy with the weight of 3 years of parallel grief. Two strangers who'd been bound together by the worst night of their lives, living 20 yards apart without knowing. Tom stood abruptly, his chair scraping back again. Grace heard him move to the window, heard the rough sound of his breathing like he was trying not to break down in front of his son. "Daddy?" Danny's voice was small, frightened. "I'm okay, buddy." But he wasn't. "Grace, I need to ask you something. Anything. Did she suffer at the end? They told me it was instant, but you were there. You heard her. Did my wife die in pain? Grace had known this question was coming, had felt it hovering in the air between them. She could lie, could offer the comfort of fiction. But Sarah Brennan had been honest with her in that crushed car, had shared her fear and her hope, and her desperate love for the child waiting at home. Grace owed her the truth. She was scared, Grace said softly, but not for herself. She kept saying Danny's name, kept saying she had to get home to you both. When the paramedics told her the injuries were too severe, she asked them to tell you she was sorry. Sorry she wouldn't see Danny grow up. Sorry she was leaving you to raise him alone. And then she asked them to take care of the woman in the car behind her, take care of me. Because I was young and shouldn't have to die on a highway in the rain. Tom made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. That's exactly what she'd say. The last thing I heard before they took her away was her singing, that lullaby. She sang it until her voice gave out. Danny slid off his chair and crossed to his father, wrapping small arms around Tom's leg. The boy didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew grief when he felt it, knew his daddy was hurting. Tom lifted him up, held him tight, and for a long moment the three of them existed in the awful beauty of connection forged through tragedy. I never got to thank her, Grace whispered, for staying with me, for keeping me sane when I thought I was going to die. I've carried that with me for 3 years, the guilt that I survived and she didn't, that I was too broken to even find out her name before my world went dark. Tom set Danny down and crossed back to Grace. She felt his hands close over hers, warm, steady, the same hands that had brushed hers when he took the sugar cup, but different now, weighted with shared history. Sarah would be glad to know you made it, he said, his voice thick. She would hate knowing you've been living alone, thinking nobody would want to share your life. That woman couldn't stand to see anyone suffer if she could do something about it. I don't know how to do this, Grace admitted. How to be someone's neighbor, someone's friend, when I can't even... You don't have to know. We'll figure it out together. Such simple words. Such impossible hope. Outside, the February wind rattled the windows, and somewhere in Grace's backyard, birds were already investigating the small wooden house a 5-year-old boy had built with his father's help. Life continuing, despite everything. But could Grace really let herself believe in it? The smell of fresh bread filled Grace's kitchen on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, yeast and warmth transforming the space into something that felt almost like belonging. She'd forgotten how much she loved to bake before the accident, forgotten that joy could exist in simple, tangible things you created with your own hands. This was what it felt like when isolation finally cracked open and let the light in. Tom had shown up that first week with a proposition. He'd repair her sagging porch steps if she'd teach Danny how to bake cookies. The boy's been eating store-bought everything since Sarah died, he'd said, a hint of embarrassment in his voice. Figure it's time he learned how real food is made. Grace had agreed before she could talk herself out of it, and now Saturday mornings had become their ritual. Flour dusted across her counter, Danny standing on a step stool beside her, Tom watching from the doorway with his coffee and his quiet observations. How do you know when it's mixed enough if you can't see it? Danny asked, his hands deep in the dough Grace was teaching him to knead. I listen to the sound it makes. Hear that? She pressed her palms into the dough, demonstrating. When it's smooth, it stops making that wet, sticky sound. It becomes quieter, more elastic, and you can feel it. The texture changes under your hands. Danny mimicked her movements, his small fingers working the dough with intense concentration. Tom had told her the boy rarely sat still for anything, but in Grace's kitchen, He became focused, patient, eager to learn the language of touch and sound that was her world. "I think I feel it," Danny said, wonder in his voice. "You're a natural." Grace smiled, reaching over to check his work. The dough was perfect, smooth and pliable, ready for its first rise. "Your mama would be proud." The words slipped out before she could stop them. For 2 weeks they danced around Sarah's ghost, acknowledging her existence but never dwelling, never pushing too hard against the wound that had brought them together. But Danny didn't flinch. "Daddy says Mama liked to cook. He says that's why he can't do it good, because he was too busy watching her and not learning." From the doorway, Tom's laugh was soft and sad. "That's about right, buddy." Grace covered the dough with a clean towel and set it aside to rise. "Tom, there's fresh coffee in the pot. Pour yourself another cup and stop hovering." "Yes, ma'am." She heard the smile in his voice, heard him cross to the counter. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd learned to move through her space without announcing himself, had stopped asking if she needed help with every small task, had begun to treat her blindness as simply another characteristic, rather than a defining tragedy. It was the greatest gift anyone had given her since the accident. "Can we go play while the bread rises?" Danny asked. "Half an hour," Grace said. "Then we'll shape the loaves." Danny thundered out the back door, and suddenly Grace and Tom were alone in the flour-dusted kitchen. She could feel his presence like heat, could sense him watching her in that way he had, attentive but not intrusive, curious but not pitying. "You're good with him," Tom said finally. "Better than I expected, honestly. Most people don't know how to talk to kids about the hard stuff. I don't sugarcoat things. Children know when you're lying to protect them, and it makes them trust you less." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "Besides, Danny's stronger than you think. He's had to be. Like you." The observation hung between them. Grace busied herself with cleaning the counter, her hands following familiar patterns. "I'm not strong. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." "I don't think there is." Tom moved closer, and Grace could smell sawdust on him again. He'd been working on her porch since dawn, true to his promise. "Grace, I need to tell you something. About why I moved here." Something in his tone made her hands still. "Okay. I didn't just pick Missouri at random. After Sarah died, I couldn't stay in Illinois. Everything reminded me of her, and I was drowning. So I sold our house, packed up Danny, and I drove. No destination, just driving. I ended up in Springfield and stopped at a diner for lunch." He paused. "The waitress asked why I looked so lost, and I told her about the accident, about raising Danny alone, about needing a fresh start somewhere nobody knew me as the widower." Grace's chest tightened. "What did she say?" "She said there was a little house for rent about 40 miles south, in a quiet town where people minded their own business. Said the place next door was occupied by a young woman who kept to herself, and wouldn't I like some peace and quiet to heal?" Tom's voice dropped. "I didn't know that woman was you. Didn't know you were connected to Sarah. I thought maybe living next to someone who understood solitude might be easier than living next to people who'd ask too many questions. And now? Now I think maybe we were supposed to find each other. Sarah and you first. Then you and me." He was right behind her now, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I don't believe in accidents anymore, Grace. I think Sarah led me here." Grace turned to face him, her sightless eyes aimed somewhere near his shoulder. "Tom, you don't owe me anything because of what happened. Your wife saved my life in that car, but that doesn't mean..." This isn't about owing you." His hand found hers, calloused fingers lacing through her flour-dusted ones. "This is about the fact that for 2 weeks, I've watched you teach my son that limitations are just puzzles to solve. I've watched you bake bread and repair fence posts and laugh at Danny's terrible jokes. And I've realized something." "What?" "That you're not broken. You're not less than you were before. You're just different. And different isn't something to hide from." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. People don't usually see it that way. "Then people are fools." The back door slammed open and Danny burst in, breathless and excited. "Miss Grace, there's birds in the birdhouse. 2 of them. They're making a nest." Grace pulled her hand from Tom's, wiping at her eyes. "Then I guess we built it just right." But as Danny chattered about the birds and Tom returned to his coffee, Grace felt something shift inside her. A wall she'd built 3 years ago beginning to crumble. She'd convinced herself that her blindness made her unlovable, that no one would willingly choose the complications of her life. But Tom Brennan was choosing it, choosing her kitchen and her routines and her darkness without hesitation. The question was whether she was brave enough to choose him back. Outside, the February cold was beginning to ease into March. The same month Sarah had died. The same month Grace had lost her sight and gained a debt she could never fully repay. But maybe Tom was right. Maybe this wasn't about debts at all. Maybe it was about second chances. Could you really build a future on the ashes of shared tragedy? The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon in late March. Ellen's voice tight with something Grace had learned to recognize as forced cheerfulness. The sound of bad news wrapped in careful words. Grace pressed the receiver closer to her ear, her free hand gripping the kitchen counter for support. This was the moment when the fragile piece she'd built would face its first real test. "Grace, honey, I need to talk to you about something." Ellen paused, and Grace could hear her sister lighting a cigarette, the scratch of the match carrying through the line. "Martin's been asking about you again." Grace's stomach dropped. Martin Holloway, her former fiancé, the man who'd promised to stand by her after the accident, who'd lasted exactly 4 months before admitting he couldn't handle being tied to a blind woman for the rest of his life. She hadn't heard his name in over 2 years. "What does he want?" "He's getting married to Diane Fisher. You remember her?" Ellen's voice carried an edge of disgust. "He wants to clear his conscience before the wedding. Says he owes you an apology, wants to meet and talk things through." I told him absolutely not, but he's persistent. Called me 3 times this week. Grace sank into a chair, her hands shaking. "I don't want to see him." "I know, sweetheart, but there's something else." Ellen exhaled smoke. "He's been telling people his version of things, saying you became bitter after the accident, pushed him away, made it impossible for him to stay. Diane's family is prominent in Springfield, and Martin's making sure everyone knows he tried his best with you." The old shame flooded back, hot and acidic. Martin had been her anchor in those early months after the hospital, the one person she'd trusted to see her at her weakest. And when he'd left, he'd taken not just himself, but her last shred of belief that anyone could love her as she was now. "Let him say what he wants. I don't care what Springfield thinks of me." "Maybe you should care." Ellen's voice softened. "Grace, you've been hiding in that house for 3 years. Martin's lies shouldn't define you, but they will if you let them. At some point, you have to stop running." Grace heard the back door open, Tom and Danny returning from their afternoon walk. Their voices carried the easy warmth of a ritual they'd developed over the past month, checking on the birdhouse and exploring the property line where Tom was planning a vegetable garden come spring. "I have to go," Grace said quickly. Thanks for telling me, Ellen." She hung up before her sister could protest, but the damage was done. Martin's ghost had invaded her kitchen, poisoning the sanctuary she'd built. When Tom appeared in the doorway, she could feel his eyes on her immediately, that uncanny ability he had to sense when something was wrong. "Grace, what happened?" "Nothing, just my sister." She forced brightness into her voice. "How was the walk?" "Don't do that." Tom's voice was gentle but firm. He crossed to her, his boots heavy on the floor. "Don't pretend with me." Danny had wandered into the living room, drawn to the toy box Grace kept there now, another sign of how thoroughly the Brennans had woven themselves into her life. They were alone, and Grace felt the fragile armor she'd rebuilt cracking under Tom's steady attention. "My ex-fiancé wants to apologize," she said finally. "He left me after the accident. Couldn't handle being with someone who—" She stopped, swallowed. "Someone broken." "You're not broken." That's not how he saw it. And now he's getting married and wants to clear his conscience before the wedding. Wants me to absolve him for abandoning me when I needed him most. Tom was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a hard edge Grace had never heard before. "What's his name?" "Why?" "Because I'd like to have a conversation with any man who made you believe you weren't worth standing by." Despite everything, Grace felt a smile tug at her lips. That's sweet, but it's not sweet. It's true. Tom's hands found her shoulders, warm and solid. "Grace, listen to me. What that man did, walking away when you needed him, that says everything about him and nothing about you. You understand?" "Intellectually, yes. But emotionally?" Grace shook her head. "Tom, you don't know what it was like. The first few months after I came home from the hospital, I was helpless, completely dependent on other people for everything. I couldn't dress myself, couldn't cook, couldn't walk from the bedroom to the bathroom without help. Martin stayed through all of that, and I thought he really meant his vows, the in sickness and health part. But he left. He left. The words still hurt, even 2 years later. Said he'd tried his best, but he couldn't sacrifice his whole life for mine. Said I needed more than he could give, and staying would only hurt us both in the long run. And maybe he was right. Maybe I do need too much." Tom's grip on her shoulders tightened. "You need exactly what every person needs, to be seen and valued for who they are. That's not too much. That's the bare minimum. You say that now, but I say that after a month of watching you live your life. After seeing you navigate a world that wasn't built for you with more grace and strength than most people show when everything's easy." His voice dropped. "Grace, I'm not Martin. I'm not going to run when things get hard. How can you know that? We barely know each other. I know that my wife died in your arms in a way. I know that you've spent 3 years punishing yourself for surviving when she didn't. I know that you're teaching my son how to find joy in small things, and you're teaching me that loss doesn't have to be the end of everything." Tom's hands moved to cup her face, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "And I know that I'm falling in love with you, and that scares me more than anything Martin, whatever his name is, could ever say." Grace's breath caught. "Tom, you don't have to say anything back. I just needed you to know. Because when people like Martin try to make you feel small, I want you to remember that someone sees all of you, the strength and the fear and the darkness, and chooses you anyway." From the living room, Danny called out a question about his toy cars, breaking the moment. Tom pulled back, his hands leaving Grace's face, and she felt the absence like cold water. I should, Tom started. "Stay for dinner," Grace said quickly. "Please, both of you. I made pot roast yesterday and there's enough for an army." She heard Tom's smile in his voice. "We'd like that." As he went to help Danny, Grace stood alone in her kitchen, her heart racing. Tom Brennan had just said he was falling in love with her. With her, the blind woman, the abandoned fiancé, the survivor of the accident that had killed his wife. It should have felt wrong, complicated, impossible. Instead, it felt like the first true thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. But Martin's reappearance had reminded her of a truth she'd tried to forget. The world outside this small pocket of safety was full of people who would always see her disability first and her humanity second. People who would question what a man like Tom saw in a woman like her. Could their fragile connection survive that scrutiny? The town's annual spring social arrived the first Saturday in April, and Grace had planned to avoid it the way she'd avoided every public gathering for 3 years, with a polite excuse and the safety of her empty house. But Tom had other ideas. This was when Grace would have to choose between hiding from judgment and claiming her right to exist fully in the world. "Danny's excited about the egg hunt," Tom said over coffee that morning, his tone deliberately casual. "And I heard there's a pie competition. Seems like someone with your baking skills might do well." Grace's hands tightened on her mug. "I don't go to town events." "Why not?" "Because..." She stopped, searching for words that didn't sound like cowardice. "Because it's easier not to." "Easier for who?" Tom's voice was gentle but challenging. "Grace, you can't hide forever. People in town barely know you exist, and the ones who do only know what they've heard secondhand. Don't you want to show them who you really are?" "What I really am is blind. That's all they'll see." "Then let them see it." Tom moved closer, his hand finding hers across the table. "Let them see a woman who's built a life despite it. Let them see you laughing with Danny, entering a pie in the competition, being part of the community. Show them that their pity is wasted on you." Grace wanted to refuse, wanted to retreat into the comfortable isolation she'd perfected. But something in Tom's words struck deep. The idea that by hiding, she was confirming every limiting belief people held about what a blind person could or couldn't do. "If I go and it's a disaster, then we come home and never mention it again. But if you don't go, you'll always wonder if you could have claimed that space for yourself." Which was how Grace found herself standing in the town square 3 hours later, the smell of grilled meat and fresh-cut grass mixing with the nervous sweat dampening her dress. Tom's hand was steady on her elbow, Danny bouncing excitedly between them, and Grace felt exposed in a way she hadn't since those first terrible months after the accident. "Miss Grace, there's a big tent with tables," Danny reported, "and lots of people, and someone's playing music on a guitar." The sounds washed over her, conversations, laughter, children shrieking, the discordant notes of amateur musicians. Grace's other senses sharpened in compensation, mapping the space, cataloging threats and safe zones. A woman's voice rose above the crowd, syrupy with false warmth. "Tom Brennan, is that you? And you brought little Danny. How wonderful." "Mrs. Fisher." Tom's voice cooled noticeably. "Nice to see you." Fisher. Grace's blood ran cold. Martin's future mother-in-law, the woman who'd been part of Springfield's social elite when Grace still lived there. Of all the people to encounter first, this was perhaps the worst. "And who's this?" Mrs. Fisher's attention swiveled to Grace, her voice dripping with the kind of curiosity that masked judgment. "I don't believe we've met." "Grace Holloway," Tom said before Grace could respond. "She's our neighbor. Grace, this is Mrs. Patricia Fisher." "Holloway." Mrs. Fisher's tone sharpened with recognition. "Grace Holloway, you're Martin's. Oh my, I had no idea you'd moved to this area." Grace felt Tom's arm tense beside her. "You know each other?" "Ancient history," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mrs. Fisher, it's been a long time." "Indeed it has. Martin mentioned you'd struggled after your—" She paused delicately. "After your accident. I'm so glad to see you're managing. And you have friends helping you navigate. How thoughtful." The condescension in those words was like a slap. Grace heard exactly what wasn't being said. How sad that she needs help. How noble of Tom to assist the poor blind woman. How limited her life must be. "Actually," Tom said, his voice hard as iron, "Grace doesn't need help navigating. She's perfectly capable. We're here because we're friends, not because I'm her keeper." Of course, of course." Mrs. Fisher's laugh was thin. "I meant no offense. It's just that Martin always said, well, never mind what Martin said. I'm sure you're doing your best with the circumstances you've been given." Rage flared hot in Grace's chest, not at the pity, which she'd expected, but at the assumption that her life was somehow less valuable, less full, because she experienced it differently. She opened her mouth to respond, but a new voice cut through the tension. "Grace? Grace Holloway, is that really you?" Grace turned toward the voice. Male, familiar but aged, carrying the distinctive rasp of someone who'd spent years shouting over machinery. Recognition clicked. "Mr. Patterson? It is you." The older man's delight was genuine, unmistakable. "I heard you'd moved back to the area, but I wasn't sure." "Tom, you didn't tell me your neighbor was Bill Holloway's daughter." "You know Grace's father?" Tom asked. "Knew him for 40 years. Best mechanic in 3 counties before the heart attack took him." Mr. Patterson's hand clasped Grace's, warm and calloused. "Your daddy was proud of you, girl. Talked about you all the time. How smart you were. How you'd gone to college. How you were going to do great things." Tears pricked Grace's eyes. Her father had died 6 months before her accident, spared from seeing her reduced to what she'd become, or so she'd always thought. "He would have been even prouder if he could see you now," Mr. Patterson continued. "Tom tells me you've been teaching young Danny here some life skills. That's real community spirit, helping a widower and his boy." Mrs. Fisher made a small sound of surprise. "I hadn't realized, Tom, you're a widower?" 3 years. Tom's arm drew Grace closer, a gesture of protection and something more. "My wife Sarah died in a car accident. Same accident where Grace lost her sight, actually. They were both there, kept each other company until help arrived. The information hung in the spring air, reframing everything." Mrs. Fisher's expression shifted. Grace couldn't see it, but she could hear it in the woman's sudden intake of breath, the recalibration of her assumptions. "How extraordinary," Mrs. Fisher said faintly. "What a small world." "Not really," Grace found her voice, steady and clear. "Just 2 people who survived trauma and found each other again. Nothing extraordinary about healing, Mrs. Fisher. It's what people do when they're given the chance." "Well, yes, I suppose." Mrs. Fisher was floundering now, her social superiority undermined. I should go find my daughter. Tom, Grace, it was lovely to see you both." She fled, and Grace felt Tom's silent laughter vibrating through his arm. "That was something," Mr. Patterson said admiringly. "Patricia Fisher hasn't been put in her place like that in 20 years. Your daddy would have loved it." As Mr. Patterson wandered off, Danny tugged on Grace's hand. Miss Grace, can we go find the pie table? I want to see if yours wins. It won't win, Grace said automatically. It might, Tom said softly. You won't know unless you try. They made their way through the crowd, and Grace felt something shifting inside her, the weight of shame and hiding beginning to lift. People greeted Tom, asked about Danny, and included Grace naturally in their conversations. Some were awkward, unsure how to interact with her blindness, but most were simply kind, curious, welcoming. When the pie competition results were announced an hour later, Grace's apple pie with the lattice crust Danny had helped her weave took second place. The applause that followed felt like absolution, but as they prepared to leave, Grace heard a voice that made her blood freeze. Grace, I heard you were here. We need to talk. Martin. After all these years, his voice still carried the power to make her feel small. Was she strong enough to face him? Martin Holloway's cologne reached Grace before his words did. Expensive, cloying, the same scent he'd worn when he'd walked out of her hospital room and her life. The spring breeze carried it across the thinning crowd, and Grace felt her carefully constructed confidence waver. This was the moment when she would either reclaim her worth or let the past define her forever. Tom's hand tightened on her arm, a silent question. Grace gave a small nod. She could do this. She had to do this. Martin had haunted her for 3 years, a ghost of inadequacy and abandonment. It was time to lay him to rest. Martin, her voice came out level, controlled. I heard you were getting married. Congratulations. Thank you. Martin moved closer, and Grace could feel him studying her, cataloging the changes 3 years had wrought. You look well. Better than I expected, honestly. The casual cruelty of it, better than I expected, landed like a physical blow, as if her baseline should have been deterioration, as if surviving without him was somehow surprising. Grace has been doing more than well, Tom said, his voice carrying an edge that could cut glass. But I don't think we've been introduced. I'm Tom Brennan. Ah, the neighbor. Martin's tone implied quotation marks around the word, suggesting something illicit, inappropriate. My mother-in-law mentioned you'd brought Grace to the social. That's very charitable of you. Charitable. Tom repeated the word slowly, dangerously. That's an interesting choice. See, I didn't bring Grace anywhere. We came together, because that's what people do when they care about each other. Grace felt the air pressure change as Martin processed Tom's words. When he spoke again, his voice had hardened. Grace, I was hoping we could talk privately. There are things I need to say to you, things that have been weighing on me. Then say them. Grace lifted her chin. Whatever you need to get off your chest, you can say it right here. I don't think this isn't appropriate for... Martin faltered. Grace, please. 5 minutes alone. That's all I'm asking. No. The word came out strong, final. You left me, Martin. You don't get to dictate the terms of our conversations anymore. A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the tension crackling between them. Grace could hear their whispers, feel their attention like heat on her skin. Danny pressed close to her side, his small hand finding hers. Is that man being mean to you, Miss Grace? Danny asked, his child's voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. Danny, hush, Tom said gently. But the damage, or perhaps the gift, was done. Martin's voice, when it came, was tight with embarrassment. I'm not being mean. I'm trying to apologize. Grace, I know I hurt you when I left. I know the timing was terrible, and I've carried guilt about it ever since. But you have to understand, I was 25 years old. I wasn't equipped to handle what happened to you. The doctors said you'd need constant care, that you might never be independent again. I panicked. You panicked, Grace repeated flatly. So you left me alone in my sister's house, barely able to dress myself, convinced I'd never have a normal life again, because you panicked. I didn't know what else to do. And look, you've managed fine without me. You've got people helping you. You're baking pies. You're functioning. Maybe it was better that I left, gave you space to figure things out on your own. The rationalization was breathtaking in its selfishness. Grace felt 3 years of suppressed anger rising like a tide, hot and cleansing. You want absolution, she said quietly. You want me to tell you that leaving was the right choice, that you did me a favor. You want to walk into your new marriage without the weight of what you did, to me. I want us both to have closure. Then here's your closure, Martin. Grace took a step forward, her voice ringing clear across the square. You were right to leave. Not because I needed space, but because I deserved better than someone who saw my worth as conditional. You looked at me and saw a burden, a tragedy, something broken that you'd have to carry forever. But I'm not broken. I never was. I was just different. And you were too small to see past that. Grace, that's not fair. You taught me something valuable, though, Grace continued, ignoring his protest. You taught me that love isn't real if it only exists when everything's easy. Real love shows up when things are hard. It stays when staying is difficult. It sees past limitations to the person underneath. Her hand found Tom's, their fingers lacing together. So thank you, Martin. Thank you for leaving. Because if you'd stayed out of obligation or guilt, I never would have learned what I actually deserve. The silence that followed was profound. Grace could feel the crowd's attention, could sense their sympathy shifting, reframing the narrative Martin had spent 2 years crafting. He wasn't the noble ex-fiancé who'd tried his best with a difficult situation. He was the man who'd abandoned someone when they needed him most. I came here to make peace, Martin said finally, his voice thin and defensive. I didn't come to be attacked. And I didn't come here to give you peace you haven't earned, Grace replied. But I'll give you this much. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to carry anger for you anymore. You're not worth the energy. Grace. We're done, Martin. Go back to your fiancé. Build your life. But don't ever use my story to make yourself look noble. What happened between us isn't a tragedy that proved too much for you to handle. It's a failure of character that you'll have to live with. Tom's arm came around Grace's shoulders, solid and warm. I think that's clear enough. Come on, Grace. Let's get Danny home. They turned to leave, and the crowd parted for them. Not with pity, but with respect. Grace heard murmurs of approval, felt the shift in how these people saw her. Not as Martin's abandoned ex-fiancé, not as the poor blind woman, but as someone who'd survived and claimed her dignity back. Miss Grace, Danny said as they walked toward Tom's truck. You were really brave back there. Was I? The bravest, Danny confirmed. Like a superhero, but without a cape. Grace laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. Tom's arm tightened around her shoulders. He's right, you know, Tom said quietly. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen. I was terrified the whole time. Bravery isn't not being scared. It's being scared and doing it anyway. Tom helped her into the truck, his hand lingering on hers. Grace, what you said back there, about real love showing up when things are hard, I meant it. I know. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Tom's voice dropped, intimate despite Danny climbing into the back seat. I'm showing up. I'm not going anywhere. And when you're ready, if you're ready, I'd like to show you what real love actually looks like. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. Tom, you don't have to answer now. Just know that I'm here, for as long as you'll have me. As they drove away from the town square, away from Martin and his guilt and the ghosts of Grace's past, she felt something fundamental shift inside her. The shame that had defined her for 3 years was gone, burned away in the confrontation she'd finally been brave enough to face. But more than that, she'd found something she thought she'd lost forever in that car accident. The belief that she was worthy of love, not despite her blindness, but as a complete person who happened to navigate the world differently. Tom Brennan had shown her that. Sarah Brennan, in her final hours, had kept her alive for that. Could she really trust this fragile, impossible hope? Summer arrived in Missouri with the weight of honey. Thick, golden afternoons that stretched long into evening, and the sound of Danny's laughter echoing through Grace's backyard, where Tom had built a swing set in May. Grace sat on her porch steps, her bare feet in the grass, listening to the life that had bloomed around her like wildflowers after rain. This was what it felt like when you stopped surviving and started living. Tom's truck rumbled into the driveway at 6 o'clock, right on schedule. He'd been working a construction job in the next county over, saving money for something he wouldn't quite tell her about yet, though she suspected. Danny had spent the afternoon with her, as he did most days now, helping her weed the vegetable garden and practice his reading. The boy had started calling her Miss Grace almost Mama last week, and neither she nor Tom had corrected him. Something smells incredible, Tom called out, his boots heavy on the porch steps. His hand found the back of her neck, warm and familiar, his thumb tracing the curve of her spine. Tell me you made your peach cobbler. I made peach cobbler. Danny picked the peaches this morning from Mrs. Patterson's tree. Grace tilted her head back, and Tom's lips found her forehead, a gesture so natural now that she couldn't remember a time when his touch had been anything but home. He's getting good at telling which ones are ripe. He's getting good at a lot of things. You've been good for him. Tom sat beside her, his shoulder warm against hers. Good for me, too. 4 months had passed since the spring social, since she'd faced Martin and reclaimed her story. In those months, Grace had learned what it meant to be chosen every single day. Not dramatically, but in the small, steady ways that mattered. Tom fixing her porch without being asked. Danny saving his best drawings for her refrigerator. The three of them developing rhythms and rituals that felt like family. Tom, Grace said carefully, we need to talk about something. She felt him tense beside her. That's never a good way to start a conversation. Ellen called today. She wants to know if I'm coming to Springfield for Thanksgiving. She wants to meet you and Danny properly, not just the brief introduction at Easter. And I want to say yes. But that means, Grace paused, choosing her words. It means making this official, us, whatever we are, because Ellen will ask, and I won't lie to my sister. Tom was quiet for a long moment. Grace could hear Danny in the backyard, singing to himself as he pushed the swing higher. The same lullaby Sarah had sung in the darkness, the one that had bound them all together across time and tragedy. What do you want to tell her? Tom asked finally. The truth. That I'm in love with you. That I'm in love with your son. That the three of us have built something real, and I don't want to hide it anymore. Grace's hands twisted in her lap. But I need to know if you want the same thing. Because if I'm just convenient or a comfortable arrangement. Tom's laugh cut her off, warm and incredulous. Grace Holloway, you are the least convenient woman I've ever met. You're stubborn, independent, and you refuse to let me help you even when you probably should. You're also the bravest, kindest, most resilient person I know. And I've been in love with you since you shattered that measuring cup in your kitchen. That's a terrible moment to fall in love with someone. It was perfect. Because that's when I realized you weren't just surviving. You were feeling, hurting, living as deeply as anyone I'd ever met. Tom's hand found hers, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. Grace, I want to marry you. I want Danny to call you Mama without the almost in front of it. I want to wake up every morning knowing you're next to me. And I want to build a life that honors what Sarah gave us both, the chance to love again. Grace's breath caught. You want to marry me? I've been saving for a ring since April. Mrs. Patterson helped me pick it out. Sapphire, because she said your eyes used to be blue before the accident. And I wanted something that remembered who you were while celebrating who you are now. Tears streamed down Grace's face, hot and cleansing. Sarah would approve? Sarah would be thrilled. She always said love multiplies, it doesn't divide, that there's enough to go around if you're brave enough to open your heart. Tom's voice grew thick. She loved you before she even knew you, Grace. Kept you alive in that car because she believed you deserved a future. I think she'd be happy knowing her son gets to grow up with someone who understands that kind of fierce, protective love. Danny's footsteps thundered across the yard. Daddy, Miss Grace, come see. The mama bird is teaching her babies to fly. They stood together, Tom's hand guiding Grace across the grass to where the birdhouse hung from the oak tree. Danny narrated in breathless detail how the baby birds wobbled on the edge of the house, how the mama bird called to them, how one finally spread its wings and took flight. It's scared, Danny observed, but it's doing it anyway. That's what brave looks like, Grace said softly, and felt Tom's hand squeeze hers. That night, after Danny had fallen asleep on Grace's couch and Tom had carried him to the truck, Tom and Grace stood on her porch in the summer darkness. Fireflies flickered like stars fallen to earth, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and went quiet. Yes, Grace said. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I want Danny to be my son. Yes to all of it. She reached up, her hands finding Tom's face, tracing the lines she'd memorized through touch. I spent 3 years believing I'd lost everything in that accident. But I didn't lose everything. I lost what wasn't strong enough to survive, and I found what was always meant to be mine. Tom kissed her then, soft and sure, and Grace felt the last piece of her broken heart slot back into place. Not healed the way it had been before. Scarred, changed, different, but whole in a new way, built from loss and survival and the unexpected grace of second chances. Sarah would have liked you, Grace whispered against his lips. I know. She told me. What? Tom pulled back slightly. The night before I knocked on your door to ask for sugar, I couldn't sleep. I was sitting on my porch, and I swear I heard her voice on the wind. Just 3 words. Go meet her. I thought I was losing my mind. But the next morning, Danny wanted hot cocoa, and I realized I'd forgotten to pack the sugar, and I thought, what the hell? Maybe it's a sign. You never told me that. I wasn't sure you'd believe me. I'm still not sure I believe it myself. Tom's arms tightened around her. But I'm grateful for the accident that brought you into her life, for the courage she showed keeping you both alive. for whatever twist of fate brought me to your door." Grace pressed her face against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. Steady, reliable home. "We should name our first daughter Sarah." "Our first?" Tom's voice cracked. "You want children?" "If we can. If it's safe. The doctors said my injuries wouldn't prevent pregnancy, just that it would be high risk." Grace felt shy suddenly, vulnerable in a way she hadn't been since Martin left. "Is that something you'd want? More children? With you?" "Everything. I want everything with you." They stood there until the fireflies faded and the summer night grew cool. Two people who'd been broken by the same tragedy and put themselves back together with borrowed sugar and birdhouses and a little boy's unconditional love. 3 months later, Grace Holloway became Grace Brennan in a small ceremony in her backyard, with Danny as the ring bearer and the birdhouse hanging like a blessing over their heads. Ellen cried through the whole thing, and Mr. Patterson gave Grace away with the gruff pride of someone who'd known her father and approved. And on Grace's finger, the sapphire ring caught the autumn light, a stone the color of eyes she could no longer see, chosen by a man who saw past darkness to the woman she'd always been. They say if you drive past the old Holloway place on Highway 65, sometimes on summer nights, you can hear a woman singing, a lullaby that drifts across the wheat fields, like a promise that broken things can be made whole again, that love endures beyond tragedy, and that the knock on your door might be the answer to prayers you didn't know you'd been praying. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment sharing what resonated with you, and subscribe for more true stories of hope, resilience, and the unexpected moments that change everything. Because everyone deserves a second chance at love, and sometimes that chance comes from the last place you'd ever expect to find it.